You were listening to the Living Room Disciple podcast. We aim to model the discipleship conversations that should be happening on couches and around dining room tables. We're trying to grow our imaginations to think about what could and should be as we follow Jesus. We're asking ourselves questions about how we're being formed more or less like Jesus by the world around us. And we invite you into that conversation. So if you find this episode helpful, make sure to share it with a friend. Also, liking and subscribing, leaving a review, all those things help us grow and get the word out there. So please be sure to do that as well.
Phil and I are so excited for you to join us today as we talk about things we're passionate about, and we hope that maybe our passion will be contagious. We're talking about childlike faith and even the fiction and the films that nurture it. We'd love to hear what fiction, what films that are specifically from the children's literature and film category nurture your own faith. What fiction forms you? Leave a comment below, and welcome.
Okay, so I am excited about our conversation today because it's one of those beautiful conversations on the surface is like really light and airy, especially coming off like our series of politics and working through suffering right now. It's kind of nice to maybe take a step back and talk about something a little bit lighter. And yet, Kelsey, I think this is one of those deeper conversations, and I can't wait to get your thoughts on it. We're going to talk about how we're formed by the stories that we tell to children, and not like the stories that me and you tell, but like the books and the movies and the shows that we like, how they can be forming us too. And I'm stoked. Have you thought about this before?
Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, it's been thought of. It's been podcast material in the past in my life. It was also a great class in seminary.
Wait, this was a class in seminary?
Yeah.
Oh my, what was the name of this class? Do you remember?
It was called Children's Literature.
Oh, that's awesome.
It was awesome. We have this amazing mentor of ours who got his Master of Arts degree in literature in, I think it was Oxford. I want to say Cambridge or Oxford, but he was also one of these guys who became a part of L'Abri Fellowship, which, if you don't know anything about that, Phil, I'm going to have to tell you, like, that's deserving of far more conversation than we have time for today. But my dad actually came to faith in part through the original iteration of L'Abri Fellowship. You might have heard of Francis Schaeffer.
Yes.
But, yeah. So Francis Schaeffer started L'Abri. J.R.R., our teacher, precious mentor at Covenant Theological Seminary, came to faith also through the ministry of Francis Schaeffer. Nancy Piercy came to faith through the ministry of Francis Schaeffer. And his rich theology laid this foundation for what it means to engage the stories of the world well. And that for the sake of our children, that includes engaging the stories that are written for children well and seeking to wisely just not only choose material, but to recognize that some of the best material is going to include those aspects of the story that we've been wrestling with in the Living Room Disciple, that we're wrestling with regarding the postures of our hearts as we engage the world, and that relate even to the stories of suffering. So the children's literature class was not about shying away from the difficult stories, but helping our children to become acquainted with the fullness of story, and with the best story, which is also equally as full in terms of suffering and death and pain and joy. And, I'm already teary today thinking about those themes, and thankful that that was chosen to be a part of our curriculum as graduate students. I mean, come on.
Super cool.
Yeah.
Super cool. So, I mean, where do we begin then, from your perspective? So, well, I'll start here. Growing up, what were some of the pieces of children's literature and
Mm,
media that you found formative for you specifically?
sure. Yeah. Well, coming out of that rich tradition I was describing, our experience in the home of books and reading aloud and even of good film, I mean, it was equally
Mhm.
as rich. My dad always read aloud to us and used voices to help portray characters
What a
really
dad.
well. Oh
That's
my
awesome.
gosh. And it ranged from things like C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, of course.
Mhm,
I
mhm.
think I still hear his voice for Reepicheep in the back of my head, and Trumpkin the dwarf. And of course, it graduated into Tolkien, so The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings. But other rich, not necessarily Christian authors, rich literature not necessarily created by Christian authors. There was a book called My Side of the Mountain that was extremely formative for my brother and me, about this
Mm,
boy who goes off to learn what it means to engage with the world on some of his family's land that was kind of remote land from where
mhm.
his family actually lived, and learning how to engage with greater agency. It reminded me, of course, of being placed in the garden and thinking about
Yeah.
how to make things flourish and multiply, and how to care for them well in a way that considered the creatures, not just what I need from them. So that was a fabulous book. And uh, Laura Ingalls Wilder, Farmer Boy, things that were wonderful chapter books. I seem to remember the chapter books most, but even like Little Bear. Did you ever have any experience of like Little Bear growing up?
It was translated into a cartoon, like an
Yes.
animated show
Yep.
on PBS. So
Mhm.
yes, that was my like Little Bear engagement
Sure.
through the early '90s.
Yes. So they were great books, and there was always humor and gentility and multi-generational things going on. So it
Mm,
was not just Little Bear himself, but his parents, his grandparents, the
yeah.
stories that the grandparents would tell the Little Bear. I mean, just rich family life that was reflected into some of those younger readers. And the way that that shaped expectation for family life, for example,
Mm,
the
mhm, mhm.
wholesomeness of that, the rightness of what it meant to be together and to laugh and to eat and to even poke fun at one another, just to help one another with these days of walking on
Mm,
the earth. All of that was founded for me through even the earliest readers that my parents chose to supply. Here's another one. Do you know A. A. Milne? Winnie the Pooh, but A. A.
okay.
Milne
Yep.
wrote poetry for young children. There's
I
2
did not know this.
slender volumes of poetry that I grew up reading. I mean, just gorgeous little ditties about like sitting on a stair. It's halfway up and halfway down, and that it's his place, halfway down the stairs.
Mm,
I mean, just so many different ways that what was also right about childhood was
mm,
reinforced in these excellent
mhm.
books. That it's right and good to be a child.
And there's something about the best children's stories that it's an adult,
Mm,
usually, right, who's the artist
yeah.
behind them. And they're casting a vision for what could be and what should be
Yeah.
to these children. And they pull from the best part of themselves to do it, right? Like
Mm,
when we create children's art, when we talk to our kids, we're trying to pull usually the best art is trying to pull the best part of ourselves and put it into this art to give them an idea of what could be and should be. And I
absolutely.
think there's some goodness to sometimes adult art trying to bear the most authentic part of ourselves and
Mm,
wrestle with that. And that's good and has place. But I think the beauty of children's art is it puts in a good way on a pedestal the the best parts of ourselves and casts it as a vision.
mhm. Yeah. I think about what you're saying here about those best parts of self. There's these layers of time that we're obviously
Hmm.
referring to. If we think about the Christian process, time, layers of time relate to our continued maturity in Christ, sanctification. And
Mhm.
so I,
Mhm.
I think of what you're saying about those best parts of self, that they're almost the coal that's
Mhm.
had the benefit of time, and it was good before, but now it's really beautiful, and
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
seen through the perspective of redemption, and of so many of the words of Jesus talking about his kingdom, like we've recently been discussing, being characterized by what it means to come to him like a child.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I just think of many layers up and down.
Lewis talked about this
Mm,
fairly extensively. The perceived like pendulum, I guess is my language for it. Where like we come into this world like a child,
mm,
and we all in some way, shape, or form lose that childishness,
yeah.
often through life experiences that force us into times that are just difficult, sometimes by choice, many times not by choice, and that seem to, the language often we use is like rob us of our innocence.
Hmm.
And again, that can come through so many different avenues for each individual's life. But then as for me, I began a journey with the Lord at 18. Um, and it was almost like there was a season in which I thought maturity in the Lord looked like being a mature person, which
Yeah.
is true. It is true.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize that in so many ways the destination of a mature person is back to the childishness I had at first, but now by conscious choice,
Mm.
instead of it just being a de facto handed to me. Like you were born, here
So
you are.
good. Yeah.
And now, like, and it's hard. We were talking about this earlier, before we hit record, that like right now I'm in a season where I feel like the things that the Lord is putting before me are so radically impossible
Hmm.
that to have faith is to willingly choose to enter into childishness.
Yeah.
Faith when everything would tell me not to have faith. Um, with the conscious understanding that I feel the way I feel today. I may disagree with myself in a few years, but the way I feel today is choosing to enter into childishness, even when I know it's going to hurt in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As you seek to follow Jesus, do you ever feel like life just gets in the way? That's why we believe it's so important to take a step back, look at the things of life, and ask, how is this forming us? See, following in Jesus' footsteps is the heart behind this podcast, and so we want you to come alongside us in that mission. Would you take a moment to visit livingroomdisciple.com and click on Become a Supporter? There, you can make a monthly contribution to the work we're doing here so we can keep giving you more resources to help form and shape you to look more like Jesus.
You mentioned film as a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can remember some of the films that I watched as a child, but I have to say that it's more of the films that I have watched with my children that have left that
Mm.
profound impact, and that help with holding those things in tension that you're naming. And some of those films are really fantastical.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to trace the lines to some of the things that you've said about what it means to come with expectation and to have our eager uh, just desire there, our belief that the Lord is going to show up, even though everything around us seems to speak to the
Yeah.
contrary, and it seems to be, doom and gloom sometimes. And yet our hearts are stirred to believe something greater than that. And I think some of the films, for example, that I'm just picturing in my mind right now really have been a part of that to me in my adulthood, bridging that gap
Yeah.
back to childlike expectation, but with that adult maturity where I'm having to choose to believe and to suspend disbelief. Like
Mm-hmm.
you're supposed to do when you watch a film, right? That we're
Yeah.
about suspending disbelief, to really get the fullness of meaning in what's being presented to us by the artist. And Have you watched much of Studio Ghibli? Like Spirited
Okay,
Away is an example.
I've seen one Studio
Mm.
Ghibli movie, Howl's Moving Castle,
Uh-huh.
and I'm ready for more.
Sure.
Although I still stand by the book was better. But anyways,
We have it somewhere in the house. I'll have to pick it up, particularly on your recommendation. I think it's in my 17-year-old's room, so she's read it.
okay, it's so
But
good.
oh,
But go on.
I believe you because the film is fantastic and
Film is good.
fantastical. But anyway,
It
you
is,
heard her
yes.
say. There is something in the character of Howl that encapsulates what we're talking about, that
hmm
he's almost become dry, and there's some scenes where he's even melting because he kind of has this
hmm
depressive state. He's kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
and he goes through a process of renewal that comes because of this very tender and I would say gentle spirited in a childlike kind of way young woman who comes into the scene and is a
hmm
part of Hal's renewal.
hmm
And so many of Miyazaki's film keep those things in tension between childhood and the beauty of childishness, but what we want
Yep.
to retain as we grow from that period of childhood, because there's also this perspective that growth and maturity is inevitable and it's going to come as we see in all of his characters, it's going to come through some kind of struggle or problem or facing a tragic flaw. I mean, like all good literature, there is
Yeah.
some kind of problem or tragic flaw that has to be faced, and that will then produce maturity. And as I look at that through the lens of scripture, it rings true because we're thinking of, as with the topic of suffering, that it's the thing that produces good character in us by the Spirit's help,
hmm
by the Spirit's power.
There's something too about the fact that like most children's literature, because we were kind of talking about story structure just a little bit there, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
gonna dive a little into that.
Good.
Much of children's literature, not all, but much, is positive to positive story arcs, which
Mm-hmm.
means that like your main character comes in with a positive trait or a positive belief about the world. That trait or belief about the world is challenged
Mm.
and they maintain, and through the maintaining of that belief or quality, they overcome, right? And so
Yeah.
there's a belief in the goodness of the world that ultimately solves the problem,
Mm.
right? There's a belief in hope that like it's a positive to positive story arc, where
Yeah.
oftentimes adult media will include a negative to positive. They
Mm-hmm.
come in with a negative trait
Mm-hmm.
and it ends positive, or sometimes positive to negative. It
Yeah.
ends in a tragedy or
Right.
dealing with the realities of life, or negative to negative. They come with a negative and then they
Yeah.
choose to hold to that harmful belief. But children's literature isn't like that. It takes this childlike quality and it holds it up as something heroic, this
Mm.
belief, this optimism, this hope. And there's something beautiful and refining about
Yeah.
reminding ourselves of that. The problem can be, and I think this is where a lot of people even listen to me, is, we see that story arc played out over 90 minutes,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and we have to play that story arc out over sometimes 90 years.
Right. Right.
And it feels different, obviously.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
I think sometimes kind of having a diet of children's media can help us sustain our
Oh,
own
yeah.
positive story arc over our lives.
That's such a good argument. We how do we nurture childlike faith or just faith in general if the adjective childlike is not palatable?
hmm hmm
How do we nurture our faith? We need the testimony of something that points to the faithfulness of the Lord, or the story that is a testament to goodness and righteousness winning.
hmm
We need those tidbits, those morsels. We don't want to starve ourselves. Our bodies can't survive if we're not going to feed ourselves.
hmm
Similarly, we have to feed our psyches, our emotions,
Yeah.
our spirits with goodness and truth and beauty. And there's a reason why Philippians 4, Paul is saying to
Yeah.
the Philippian church, think on these things. What is true? What is commendable? What is admirable? What is beautiful? What is good? And so children's literature, it allows us to feast on the good while also presenting that feast to our own children.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking as you were talking about story arcs, I was thinking about something that I know of Andy Crouch, who
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big fan.
Love. Yeah, same.
Oh my gosh. And he talks about how in the Christian walk, we can tend to tell a bad news to bad news theology. So, like the redemptive
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
narrative, we can spoil it and shrink it down from bad news to bad news instead of, or we could even shrink it from bad news to good news instead of recognizing that our redemptive narrative, the best story, which we need to be telling our children and helping them to see all other story through this best of stories. But it starts with good news, with the love of the Father that was so big
Mm-hmm.
that it couldn't be contained, and it manifested in creation, that he
Yeah. Oh, I love it.
created out of his fullness and for his joy, right? And then also for our joy, like that we would be able to have a relationship with him and be full because of having a relationship with our maker, the author. That brings up an interesting thing to think about, what characters would really like to meet the author, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
what good news is that? And also to know that even though it goes through those valleys and it goes through this rebellion and fall and curse and
Yeah.
death and sickness, that all of those things are, just difficulties and obstacles along the
Mm-hmm.
way, but that the story doesn't end there as so much bleak adult fiction can, as you're pointing
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Ironically, you just said like the story doesn't end there.
Yeah.
Not always, but sometimes adult media, and I just mean that as like just general market,
Mm,
although some probably include a bunch of things written and made for high school and above.
sure.
In an attempt to feel adult and realistic and authentic, which I understand, it tells an incomplete story.
Hmm.
And it's always because, then the reason I say that is because the true story is that there is redemption coming. That redemption may be beyond our lifetime, so that redemption may not be in our lifetime. Many people will, have their story here on Earth in this life end incomplete and shattered in a way that is. And we need to tell these stories. Like we need to have this meditative element to
Right.
our media. And so I'm not casting that aside. But when our diet becomes, when the only thing we read is Ecclesiastes and Job, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like,
Yeah.
right? Or Judges, and we just feast only on these little parts of Scripture,
Hmm.
and we don't feast on Scripture as a whole. It's the same thing, right? If we don't feast on a wide variety of literature, including and media, including children's songs and
Hmm.
children's books and movies, when that is not a part of our diet, we become lopsided. Or
Yeah.
we're likely to push down our hopes and give in to cynicism
Hmm.
because we're not catching a deeper vision for the whole story, which is why children's literature does such a good job, because authors are usually want to leave the kids with hope, right? Like
Right.
that's
Right.
what we're looking forward to,
Or
is we're
like,
hopeful.
okay, now it's time to sleep. Rest
Yes.
well. Like
Yeah.
that requires a happy ending.
It does require, yes, it does. Um, and sometimes just the happy ending at the end of a Pixar movie
Yeah.
can be a little bit of the reminder that we need, that despite what we're seeing today, that there is going to be a happy ending.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
if not in this life, in the next.
I'm going to it's not pushback. It's more of a pursuing a little bit of the rabbit trail that you pointed us down for a bit when you were thinking about adult and adolescent fiction. And bear with me as I describe what I'm seeing as helpful, even in
Okay.
those, but not that we have a diet on just that one thing. So I think we're
Mm.
making a really good case for having a diverse diet in our fiction, in our film watching, and just as we would, on our plate, that we're going to want to have lots of different colors and protein and vegetables and carbohydrates, right?
Okay.
When we are looking at the different types of fiction and even at the different stages of life that we might consume them, there are some different ways that it can stoke our learning as learning beings, the different dimensions that it connects with. So bear with me a little longer.
Okay.
Our affections, the affections of our heart, are shaped so beautifully and well by the full story that is a good news to good news story. It's wholesome, it's good, it's true, it's lovely, it's beautiful. We start asking questions when we're teens, and some of the literature that we the literature that we read asks us
Hmm.
questions or draws us into asking more questions. And so the affections of our heart may have been stirred and even nurtured well by the one type of fiction. Well, this other one, maybe it's dystopian, maybe it ends with more questions than it even began with. And it
Hmm.
causes us to engage in some ways mentally that aren't just the empty knowledge of Ecclesiastes. Like it's causing us to ask and to examine those stories that might be poorer stories, and that they're
Hmm.
giving us those cognitive categories for being able to discern. We engage in critical thinking processes from those exposures to with good framework, with healthy framework. I don't want to just say, so go and
Hmm.
saturate yourself in this really bleak fiction. I don't mean that.
Yeah.
But I do mean that we build categories of discernment when, with a healthy biblical framework, we are taught to examine, and we learn to even ask some of the questions that good fiction that is still difficult in its ending, that it helps us to ask those questions. Dickens helps me to ask questions. Uh, Many of the more modern authors, I mean, even what is painted for us in F. Scott Fitzgerald's work, and some of those where you watch the flapper lifestyle and it's really
Hmm.
vacuous. It's an empty lifestyle. And you ask you, okay, wait a minute. Where does meaning come from? Is it just from partying and flirtations?
Mm.
Those are great things to have exposure to with the fullness of story to back us up as we examine. And so we're learning on more levels than just,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I'm tracking it, and I think one of the struggles, and for the record, I think this cycle is very natural. I don't even think we
Mhm.
need to necessarily change it.
Sure.
But the struggle seems to be, how do you mature in
Mhm.
your childishness
Yeah.
instead of maturing out of your
That's
childishness?
good. That's a good
You know what I
question.
mean?
Mhm.
Like, because I feel like we all need to begin wrestling with difficult questions, but the call from Jesus, I believe, is to begin to answer those difficult questions like a child
I
would.
think that's so good. Yes. Yep.
But for whatever reason, we don't do that. I
Mhm.
didn't do that anyways. Let me just speak for me. Phil didn't do that. Phil started to think that he could answer those questions, solve those problems,
Mm,
and in
mhm.
some way, shape, or form, be the solution and the hope that's needed to answer these questions. Or I started to become puffed up and believing that like I had somehow grown wiser because I was now asking the right questions and formulating my
Mhm.
own answers to them.
Mhm.
Um, and and then it isn't until later, right, that I learned that like, oh, like the answer to like the answer never changed,
Right.
right? The
Yeah.
questions changed, but the answers never changed, right?
Yes.
The hope, love, a genuine, radical, ridiculous belief in a God that I cannot see
Mm-hmm.
is still the answer,
Yes, that's
no
exactly
matter the
right.
complexity of the question. And yet, that isn't how many of us, some of us have that testimony like that, but that isn't my testimony. My testimony is far more that there was a season, even in walking with Jesus, in which, I didn't, still don't come back to childlike faith when faced with adult-like questions.
I'm hearing that. And I'm really glad that we're following the rabbit trail so that we're giving some of, the nod to that this is a part of why, this is hugely why we continue to feast on the goodness of children's literature as adults, and that we can even see it as a feast. I'm thinking of my own experience of the questions, and when it hit me in life and the people with whom I had relationship, so many of those questions came at a time when I was seeking the approval of my peers, and that they asserted that I needed to question my faith. And that questioning then becomes the epitome of maturity, as we're kind of dancing around, that it's questioning that becomes the epitome of maturity. And I would suggest really strongly here that questions for questioning's sake becomes that emptiness as well. That questions that don't point to the fact that there is a God with all the answers, an omniscient, omnipotent author. That when we just camp out in the questions in order to kind of derive maturity and power for ourselves in those. I mean, I think of the questions that the serpent asked. Did God really say?
Yeah.
The questions end up doing greater damage if we don't also feast on the answers. Or because they're going to insist on being answered. We're going to get to a place where we're going to answer them poorly if we don't feast on the goodness, the good answers. Does that make sense? That's where I was going.
It does.
With that.
It makes me think, and maybe you're alluding to this. It makes me think of the movement of deconstruction.
Yeah, exactly.
In the church, right? Which, for the record, when we talked about this like almost 2 years ago, we kind of said too, like, this is not new to the faith. It's just popular at the moment or popularized at the moment. But right. There's a work. So deconstruction, right? The work of asking questions, and then I think what ends up happening is a superiority complex that gets formed because we feel as if, like, after 2,000 years, we just suddenly we're so smart to start asking the right questions, as if, man, gosh, we're just, it's like chronological snobbery at its best. And not to, I should take a step back. And for those of us who are deconstructing genuinely, by which I mean working through a season of deep struggle with our faith, it makes a lot of sense to have those moments. I have had those moments. Many of us have. But those moments do not make us morally or academically or cognitively superior to those who are not currently struggling and deconstructing. But when we are, so the idea of deconstructing, of wrestling with the questions that intersect our faith and saying, I don't see an answer that reconciles these things, and then asking the question, what do I do with that? And some people go down a rabbit trail of just choosing to try to undo all of it, right?
Yeah.
And then others go down a path of saying, I can't reconcile that. I will choose to go forward, even though I cannot reconcile these two things.
Right.
And the thing is our children's literature and movies, Christian and non-Christian alike, actually often come to that same point of contention. There's a belief I have about the world. It no longer can be reconciled based on what I've seen. And then what do I do with that? And often in children's literature, the protagonist chooses to maintain that positive belief and act out of it.
Right.
And they usually see the answers come together at the end of the story.
Yeah, particularly if it's I'm thinking as you talk about some of that choosing, the vocabulary that's often used as leap of faith vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
this is where what we're talking about differs from that existential concept, that there is actually a foundation of goodness that has been experienced,
Mm-hmm.
and that the child who is confronted by challenge chooses to grasp hold of the faithfulness that they've
Mm-hmm.
experienced, the goodness that they have known, instead of diving into the despair of the unknown, which,
Mm-hmm.
there will be that tension humanly, that there will be a vast amount of unknown ahead of us. And the older we
Mm-hmm.
get, the more we realize we don't yet know, and that
Yep.
we don't see clearly. And the existentialist has argued that it's a leap of faith moment, but I would say that comes from a foundationless place. And the other thing that I
Yeah.
would say, even though I'm kind of hopping away from that philosophy really quickly, is that to the world, a deconstruction that doesn't wind up in either this postmodern place or this existential leap of faith, it is deemed as foolish. And
Yeah.
this is where scripture again just feeds me that the Lord has chosen the foolishness or the foolish things to shame the wise, and he has chosen the weak things to shame the strong. And I think of the parallel passage of, for the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom,
Yeah.
and the strength of God is, or sorry, the weakness of God rather, is stronger than man's strength. And those
And
things correct me.
the what does it say? The gospel is um, foolishness to
Hmm.
those who are perishing.
Yeah.
Um, but what is it? What is it's the hope of salvation for those who are
Yeah.
being
For
saved,
those who
something like
believe,
that.
it's the power of
For those,
God. Hmm.
thank you.
Yeah.
Uh, and in a sense, the gospel is a children's story.
Yeah. It is.
Like at its heart, right? Like
Yes.
there is a, a child literally brought
Yeah.
into the story to not to grow in dominating strength,
Mm.
but to grow in meekness and in love and in kindness for the salvation of the world,
Yeah.
not through violence but through love. This could be a Disney movie, right? Like this
Yeah.
is,
Yes.
like this is Andrew Peterson. Have you read the Wingfeather saga? Have we talked
I've
about
read a
this?
good portion of it, not all of
Oh
it.
my
My
gosh.
big girls are kind of just too old, and my
They're
little one
not.
has been sensitive to some of the, what are the bad guys'
uh,
names again?
oh man. The fangs.
Yeah, the fangs of Dang. Yeah,
The
she's a little
fangs of
sensitive
Dang.
about the fangs of Dang.
Oh man. My boys, we read it together and it was so beautiful. But the reason I bring it up is Andrew Peterson, kind of like I don't know if it's like his quote generally about
Mm.
everything or just about the stories is he would just say like it's all true.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
all true,
Mhm.
Um in fact, there's a bookstore in my local hometown, and we were just in it yesterday. And he had signed a bookshelf,
That's so cool.
and
That's fun.
underneath his
That's super
signature,
fun.
he wrote, "The stories are true."
Yeah.
And what he's getting at is that the truest stories, oftentimes the stories we tell for our children,
Mhm.
are true in a way that most other stories are not,
Yeah.
because they're more comprehensive. They tell the good, the
Mm.
bad, and the really good. you know
Yes.
that
Yes.
oftentimes we can't see, that really good light that oftentimes we can't see in the middle of our
Mm.
darkness. And the art that comes out of those of us who are without hope is incomplete art.
Yeah.
But when we dig into stories that we want to write for children and we want to capture the full truth of life, we always end, for those of us who are believers following Jesus, we always end with a great light, because we know that even if we don't feel it, the truth is there's a really great light.
Mm.
What is it Madeline Ingalls says?
Yeah.
It's my day to butcher quotes. I think Madeline Ingalls writes something like, if you have a story that's too tough for adults, you have to write it for children.
There you go. Yeah.
Something to that effect. And I think that's why children's literature and stories can be so formative in a positive way for us as believers.
Yes.
And I would say, whether you have children or not, or if your children are grown, to pursue those stories, because they feed that child in us,
Yeah.
that the child that should become more mature, the child of choice, not the child of circumstance. Like
That's
the
good.
person we want to become, that chooses childlike faith. That has no longer been born with it per se. You know what I mean? It's something that the world has taken or tainted or robbed us in some way. Again, not for everyone, but for many of us. And then to enter into the process of disciplined childishness, disciplined childlikeness, I think is inseparable from having a disciplined diet of children's media.
Yeah. Yes. I really appreciate that we've had a chance to explore a lot of these themes. And I have running around in my mind some thoughts about what it means to be childlike in Christ, to cast off maybe the things of childishness that we would say, are like those tantrums and those self-centered things, but to
Mm-hmm.
embrace, as you're saying, those choices to be found as children in the Father and to follow
Yeah.
along in our older brother's footsteps through the fullness of the story that he's given us, and to find that
Yeah.
in him all stories are true. That's really cool. It's really cool.
Yeah.
The Living Room Disciple podcast exists to explore the ways we are formed by our experiences, our culture, our beliefs, and our habits. And we are passionate about seeing followers of Jesus transformed to live as Jesus lived. For more information or to support our work, visit livingroomdisciple.com today. We want to thank Micah Pop for producing the podcast, Eric Church for getting it to you, and Daniel Ramirez for composing the music. And thank you for listening to the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home.